Hello, the time's 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's America Walks webinar, Walking and Walkability in the Time of COVID-19, New Policies and Practices. My name's Ian Thomas, State and Local Program Director with America Walks, and running the webinar technology today is my colleague, Operations Development and Video Manager, Kelsey Card. This webinar is made possible through the generous support of our sponsors, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and their Active People Healthy Nation program, the Association of Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals, MIG, BetterHelp, and the Everybody Walk Collaborative. Before introducing today's topic and speakers, I want to let you know that closed captioning is available for this webinar, and you can look in the chat window in your GoToWebinar panel and click a link there to access closed captioning. And also to remind you that we want you to join the conversation. Simply click on the tab marked Questions in the GoToWebinar dashboard, and then type your question or comment into the box. We'll address as many as we can after the presentations in our discussion section. And for questions we don't have time for, I'm going to ask our panelists to provide written responses, which we will post online along with the webinar recording. Today, we're going to explore how the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting the walking movement. It's becoming apparent that physical distancing, working from home for those of us who have the privilege of being able to do that, and a slower economy are going to be with us for a while. What does this mean for walking and walkable community advocacy? How is the new normal impacting pre-existing racial and economic disparities? What can we learn from this experience to advance health equity and access to safe places to walk and move for everyone? To respond to these questions, of experts from diverse fields. Jim Salas is the Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Family Medicine and Public Health at the University of California, San Diego, and also longtime Director of Active Living Research. Alison Arieff is Editorial Director of the Bay Area Urban Planning and Policy think tank, SPUR, and a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. Destiny Thomas has 6 years of experience as a planner with the City of Los Angeles and the State of California, and is now the CEO of Thrivance Project, a consulting firm grounded in dignity-infused civic engagement. And Don Kostelek is a 17-year professional in transportation planning, comprehensive planning, and health analysis, working with Vitruvian Planning in Boise, Idaho. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to this America Walks webinar. And Alison, we'd like to start with you because your New York Times article, The Magic of Empty Streets, appeared in early April, just as stay-at-home orders were starting to take effect. And it documented programs across the country and around the world which were opening up streets for pedestrians and cyclists as a response to the dramatic reduction in traffic volumes. Alison, I know you've continued to follow this phenomenon. How successful have these programs been, and what's next?
So far, I think they've been, sorry, let me show my screen here. So far, I think there's been a lot of success, but it depends on where you're at, right? I mean, Paris is opening hundreds of miles of streets. Oakland, California has opened 72. New York has been slow to open streets to people, not cars. So it really depends. As you'll see in my presentation, one of the most amazing things through all this has been a complete drop in pedestrian fatalities and also an incredible increase in air quality. Two things which we couldn't have anticipated would have come about so quickly. Ian, I can't hear you right now. Shall I just
Um,
proceed?
no, I just wanted you to continue into your presentation, Alison.
Oh,
Thank you.
okay. Sorry, sorry. This is the first one I've done when I don't see anybody, so it's hard to get the cues. So, as you see from this opening slide, I think the most valuable lesson that we can learn right now, one of them, is that we really need to think about our streets and cities and towns as places for people, not cars. And okay, of course, we're having a few technical difficulties. There we go. Um, Efforts to stem the spread of COVID-19 have offered us this rare experiment, and we can see, as I mentioned before, this is what it's like to not have traffic, dirty air and honking horns and pedestrian fatalities and all the other things that we've come to be so used to. We're seeing what happens when we can design for people, not cars. This is a closed off street in New York City, and I hope to see more of them as we continue. Streets are being transformed throughout the world. And one thing I want to point out is that these aren't expensive interventions. They're not high-tech interventions. You see that the man walking his dog in the upper right there, this is in Dublin. They just painted the street so people know how far away to stand from each other. That's a farmer's market on the left. That's still open for business, but they've made accommodations to allow people to congregate there. You see at the bottom right restaurants that are doing pick up at the front door, so human contact is minimized. All of these things are sort of quick, cheap solutions to help us adjust to our new reality. It seems like every week we're learning that this is going to go on for longer and longer. So I imagine that we're going to see more and more of these adaptations, and many of them will become permanent. And I do think we'll see somewhat of a whole scale reevaluation of what it means to be a storefront, how businesses will operate. What's striking is that what was once seemingly impossible is now possible. Certainly in San Francisco, where I live, any mention of a bike lane is met with, community outrage. It's very hard to get these things done. This is a view of Bogota, where they just put cones down, and now it's a bike lane. So these kind of quick and cheap projects have been really transformative, and we need to make them permanent. So again, this is what we're seeing. Cities are closing roads to cars, people are walking and biking, pedestrian fatalities are plummeting, air quality is improving, speed limits are reduced, bike lanes are being built. Even this picture here is a golf course in San Francisco that was shut down for golf and open to pedestrians. Unfortunately, at least here, it was actually reopened for golf, which doesn't seem to me an emergency at this point. So we've seen this kind of quick action before. A belief in bad air in the 1800s led to the creation of generous public spaces like this, like Central Park, which you see here. More recently, during the Great Recession, we saw how this led to a rethinking of vacant and underutilized spaces in cities. What you see here on the left is Parking Day, which turned into what we call parklets. This became one of the most quickly co-opted government policies that I've ever seen. It went from a guerrilla action to an official city department in less than 5 years. So I'd love to see this kind of super quick transformation. But this current movement is also laying bare the stark reality of income inequality. Higher income people are in a position to stay home while so many others are not. And this is just one of the infinite truths that make COVID-19 so tragic. 1 in 3 Americans, that's more than 100 million people, do not have a park within a 10-minute walk of their home. And even if they can go outside, there is nowhere for them to go. We can't fix all of this now, but it does really urge us to rethink land use, how we're creating cities and towns, how we're thinking about neighborhoods, and even more importantly, how poorly the system is working for so many people throughout our country. Where I live in San Francisco, they've made an active effort to have a public space within 10 minutes of every resident and have spent the money to do so. This is something I believe that all cities and towns should be doing across the United States. This isn't a new problem. This crisis is just exposing how badly things have been working. This photo shows a bus stop that isn't really a bus stop. It's got no shade. It's got no place to sit. the usage of streets where people are an afterthought is nothing new. And I think that COVID-19 has really shown the necessity of us addressing this full on. So how can we think about equity and about access to opportunity moving forward? As the people on this call are people who think about public space, and historically public space has been a place to bring people together, and now we need to think about creating public space to bring people together while also keeping them apart. This taped off auditorium seating shows one way to do this. I think over the next weeks, months, and years, we're going to have so many challenges, from landscape architecture to design to public health to access to opportunity and jobs, that really address not only the crisis that we're in now, but the crisis that really this country has been in for some time, about some people having access to just about everything and the majority of people having access to nothing. And that's all from me now. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Alison. I really appreciate your bringing our attention to the racial and economic disparities that are so prevalent in the United States, rooted in historical injustices. And this leads me to our next panelist, Destiny Thomas. Destiny is an anthropologist planner whose research has focused on the trauma environment for people of color and how to respond with strength-based narrative. Destiny, please give us your perspective on the present moment.
Thank you so much, Ian, for having me. And I appreciate having the opportunity to take up this particular space in this conversation. I have been communicating with other planners, Black women in particular, and engineers over the past several weeks. And this prevailing question of, open to whom, and this very strong desire to resolve the tension between having to choose between equity and going outside is a really unfair position for a lot of people to be in. And so I'm honored to be able to use my voice today to shed light on some of the other considerations that people are having to make during this crisis. So I want to frame this a little bit in how I've sort of arrived at how I feel about and think about this broader open streets or safe streets or complete streets discussion. A lot of the conversation that I've been having about this has been on Twitter. And Twitter is not the best place to be doing community engagement. I would also argue that having Zoom meetings is probably not the best site for getting community feedback about interventions. And I know that we're all doing the best that we can to adapt to the circumstances that we find ourselves in, but we can't lose sight of the fact that our personal experiences and relationships to and with the built environment don't always match that of other people who this crisis has really, really lifted up, are experiencing disparity by way of structural racism that's been pervasive since the inception of this country. So I took a couple of snippets from Twitter that kind of got me going, but the ways in which we talk about the public realm or the built environment is what I want to center today's discussion around. And so on the previous slide, we saw that, open streets equal happy kids. And I'm sure that that's the experience of a lot of people. But this photo was taken almost 3 years ago, where I myself was a planner on a project in South Central and was very excited to be implementing or supporting the implementation of a reconfiguration of a street in a community where they hadn't seen any meaningful investments in about 40 years. And we went out there as a data collection effort to sort of celebrate with the community, but also to get feedback from the children, right? Because children were who we were basing our justification for the reconfiguration on. The data was showing children were more likely to die as a result of crashes. And there was a young woman that really captured my heart, because no matter how many times we rewrote or reiterated the question to her, her response was the same. that she felt safe when she was inside. There was no feature outside that I could offer her that would make her choose being outside over being at home. And we don't know where she got this perception from, right? It could be coming from the attitudes of the adults around her, could be something she encountered through media, but it could very likely also be what the rest of the built environment and the sociological structures that uphold and enforce it are like for her on a day-to-day basis. So I want people to think about some of the other realities that are being mentioned in these informal conversations, right? About the fact that mutual aid groups in a city that has just committed to creating 70 miles of open streets, they're being arrested because they look suspicious while they're in said streets. The unfair and unjust enforcement of PPE in a neighborhood where people are literally dying in droves to the point where there's not enough refrigerated trucks to house their bodies. And then more recently, the execution of Ahmaud Arbery, who was literally jogging down the middle of a street, which I would also add is a configuration that a lot of Black planners and engineers have been asking us to consider, because having visibility is one of the ways that we feel safer when we are outside accessing active transportation. And so these are the types of considerations that I want us to start making when we think about responding quickly or having quick build alternatives during this crisis. Before I go any further, though, I want to make sure we have a refresher about redlining. Somebody is out there rolling their eyes right now. But I'm okay with that, because redlining was not just a direct component of, housing disparity or inequality. It was a process by which decisions were made about the humanness and dignity of the communities that those decisions were made about. And so while the outcomes of redlining had much to do with housing and were probably very much inspired by other transportation planning practices, we cannot lose sight of what the process of redlining said about who had a voice in these decision-making moments, and who had a right to be opportunistic and entitled to space at land at any given point. I think one of the ways we resist this very bad habit is by operationalizing dignity. I think in order to arrive at that, I've underlined the word gatekeeper here on my slide. I'm an anthropologist, so words mean things to me. They're very important to me. And I think about how we're doing the Crash Not Accident campaign and how we're doing this push to get media to acknowledge the actual driver of the vehicle, not just saying people were killed by cars. And I think that the gatekeepers here are important to lift up as the facilitators of the systems and processes and policies that are literally killing us today. And so when we talk about operationalizing dignity, we need to be seeking out opportunities, I know that's the word of the day, to dignify our workforce. Are they a part of the conversation and decision-making process? Or are they just expected to carry out the decision because we're in a pandemic? Same with our community partners and CBOs who've been trying to repair relationships with local governments for the past 50, 60 years. Now is not the time to abandon them and exclude them from these discussions. The same with residents, and definitely we need to start rethinking about how we dignify our relationship to the land, because I can almost bet that once we have figured out this COVID-19 crisis, we will need to have all hands on deck regarding the climate crisis. One point of juncture for this discussion is understanding the construct of place. When you hear the word place or outside or even street, it could mean something completely different to you from what it means to other people. And so I just have here a couple of communities to consider when we think about the functionality and the exotification of being outside, right? There are underground economies and exploited workers who experience outside much differently and need to use it for much more than recreation. There are activists, mutual aid groups, and community assets that people are relying on for life, for quality of life, and for livelihood right now they need to be involved in these decisions. We have curbside residents who don't have the privilege of physical shelter. We have youth, we have elders who are literally relegated to being inside regardless of the solutions that we come up with. And then we have people living with disabilities who it's really shocking to me that we still have failed to center them even in the midst of a public health crisis. And then lastly, as we are to consider our relationship to the land, we really need to be thinking about air and water quality, heat pavement indexes, and the waste toxic industry and blight are creating a different experience for so many people when they go outside. I want to wrap this up by encouraging people to ask the tough questions. Who is this decision benefiting or harming, right? How are we contributing to mistrust and structural racism by doing this the way that we're doing it? Who have we silenced? Who are the people who we've invited into this field through diversity efforts and campaign, and then continue to harm them by not including them in these discussions? How are we setting a precedence for ongoing planning processes? What are we saying about who's invited to civic engagement moving forward if we continue to roll these programs out the way we have been? Who is traumatized just plainly by the structural violence that this reminds us of? How are we undermining our valid arguments for the benefit to these very creative concepts? I'm excited about open streets too, but I can't help but to acknowledge that we have undermined their value by not centering the people who we're saying they are most beneficial to. And then lastly, how are we contributing to the model minority constructs, climate instability, and a culture of supremacy and entitlement that looks and sounds very similar to people on maybe the more conservative end of the spectrum who we would deny having anything to do with? So I want to end by saying this. It's very easy to end up on the wrong side of history. I doubt that they were calling redlining while it was happening. So I want us to think about in what ways this story will be told in the future. I have started to call this practice of excluding people from civic engagement in the name of a pandemic purple lining, right? We have decided who is valid, who is visible, and who is human and worthy of engaging in these processes. Is that the way we want our field to be represented again by the next generation of planners and engineers? And then lastly, I would say if we're really invested in healing during a public health crisis, we should be thinking about these systems of oppression in ways that are interlocking in our understanding, and our solutions should also be constructed in a way that is interlocking in our desire to provide and achieve holistic healing. So our solutions have to be just as dynamic and complex as the root causes. And then I'll leave you with some key pillars to adaptive planning. I think there are other groups who have also given us similar guidelines for how we can move forward. But I think having ongoing and open discourse, participatory decision-making, building capacity so that people have the proper language and access and resources to really be a part of the conversation, having tools and strategies that carry us beyond the moment in a way that's equitable, and then really looking to implement policies that continue to prevent the harm and disparity that we're seeing complicate the COVID-19 situation. So, of course, everyone who knows me from social media knows I think all forms of transit should be free. And I think one way you can reduce anxiety for people who may or may not be interested in using a bike as a mode is to give away free bikes, because a lot of our choices have a lot to do with anxiety and harm that we have in relationship to the built environment. Thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion.
Thank you, Destiny, for reminding us of the lived experience of so many people and the injustice behind that lived experience. I do think we have an opportunity, as everything is being reevaluated at the present time, especially with regard to the public space, to start that healing process and build in a new system that is equitable. We'll come back to some of these topics when we get to our Q&A section a little later. And I want to just give a quick reminder to our 1,000 participants in this webinar to send us your comments and questions. Lots are coming in already using the questions tab in the GoToWebinar control panel. Well, next up on our panel is transportation planner Don Kostelek. Don was really fast to recognize both a threat and an opportunity for pedestrians in the way that crosswalks at intersections are programmed. And Don, I'd love to hear the story of your conversation with the North Carolina DOT and other planning and design issues that come to the fore during the pandemic.
Thanks, Ian. Going back to what Allison talked about, that a lot of the things in our urban environment today are based on public health from 150 years ago. And if you trace the origins of urban planners, civil engineers, landscape architects, it goes back to health. If you go deeper into those professions' code of ethics, you will commonly find the phrase health, safety, and general welfare. That stems from the 10th Amendment of our Constitution and 200 years of case law stemming from it, which is what governors are using for the orders they have. That's where all of this starts to relate. And what I want to do in here is tell you a story, but also give you as community members the resources and links to understand that what we're asking for in the conversion of pedestrian push buttons and the reallocation of street space is nothing new and nothing foreign, and there's plenty of documentation to back that up. When I first heard of the efforts to, well, I'm trying to advance slides here. When I first heard of the efforts to combat COVID, and I looked at the National Institute of Health research and found that the virus can live on plastic and stainless steel for up to 3 days, I said, well, that's what pedestrian push buttons are made of, and it made me rethink my daily journey to the grocery store and other places in my neighborhood. If you follow me on Twitter, you probably realize I'm not historically the biggest fan of the North Carolina Department of Transportation and probably find a little too much glee in that, which prompted me to email their division office in Asheville, North Carolina, where I used to live, and ask simply that they consider making it so you did not have to push a button to get the walk signal, or what is called recall mode in traffic engineering parlance, where there's a fixed time to the signal. And to my glee, and they have some new leadership in that division, Mark Gibbs and Anna Henderson, they did it. And they're looking to see about making it permanent. And we really can't ask much more than that in these times, and also knowing they're being pulled in different directions because of this. So that caused me to put out these two images. These are both where I live now in Boise, and ask people on Twitter and elsewhere, what's the difference between these two push buttons? And the one in the top left is in downtown Boise. And I always thought the traffic signal controller box art behind it really illustrated what it was like to put our faith in these signals and infrastructure systems when crossing some of these streets. The bottom right one is about 2.5 miles southeast of downtown Boise. This is the same technology. It sounds the same when you push the button. However, the top left one does not require you to push the button to get the walk signal. The bottom right one does. How, as a user, do you know that? And I'd be lying if I said I didn't have a grin come to my face when I saw some newspaper headlines starting to use the term beg buttons, and realizing that that has come into the lexicon. It's something we do need to be careful about, and to realize that all beg buttons are push buttons, but not all push buttons are beg buttons. The one on the top left serves a very functional and real safety purpose in our downtown environment, and that is to provide an audible and vibrotactile cue to people who are blind and vision impaired, so they know when the walk signal is on. The one on the bottom right does the exact same thing, but everybody has to push it. Well, how do we know the difference? And how do we start looking at these things? If you're an advocate, you're on a steering committee, you're on a project committee, the transformation of pedestrian push buttons during COVID-19 has really given us an opportunity to say, you know what, we shouldn't have to push a button to get a walk signal in our downtown cores and our other walkable urban centers. There's certainly some suburban corridors with minor side streets with different cycle links and different characteristics where that can be a valid thing. So maybe we do what the top left does. And in Toronto, when the button is only there for purposes of the blind and visually impaired, we let people know. And I've collected the many temporary signs that have been put on push buttons through this, starting with the bottom right, which was the first time I think I remember seeing it coming from down under in Australia. But these are the many applications that have been put out there. And what I find ironic is, as much as we hear about signage and MUTCD and we got to follow this, wow, you know, look at what's happened here. Some are more complicated than others, but we've certainly responded to this in a very positive way. And the ask for your communities is to, one, point out this is being done in other places, and two, let it be a test, let it be a type of tactical urbanism to let communities go farther and consider these changes to be permanent once we come out of this. The other piece is, and again, a lot of this COVID stuff is still unknown, but all indications are we're in for some cycles of this. And our hopes can be, and what we should ask of our agencies is that, well, now we have the playbook. I hope they've documented it. I hope they've done some counts and observations about what happened so we can know what to do in the future as we go through these cycles. Transitioning a little to street reallocation, and Eric Langfried, who I've been in contact with for several years from back in my days in North Carolina, made a good observation in this tweet. Streets are closed for through traffic all of the time in our cities. We do it for utilities, we do it for developers, we do it for lots of things. So it's not real foreign to ask for travel lane closures on a temporary basis for people to walk and bike during COVID-19. And the good thing is, most of your agencies should already know what the tools and applications should be for that. We're not reinventing the wheel, and we shouldn't settle for being told that we are. Where I live in Southeast Boise, you can't see on the far side of this road under the trees, is a side path that functions as the Boise River Greenbelt. It's the people's thoroughfare here in Boise, and it's been very, very busy as our weekends have warmed up. It's next to our typical 4-lane suburban arterial. And I looked over there last week and I'm like, wow, they've coned off a lane for people walking and biking. And of course, people, I'm saying, surely you jest, Don, that would never happen out here with our highway agency. Well, no, it was for tree trimming, which is great. That's a very valid purpose. Why are these lanes coned off for tree trimming? Well, the people need space to work. The people need to be safe when doing so. And we've made a determination that for the length of this application, the lane can be closed and the street can handle it just fine. All we're asking for is the exact same thing in reallocation of street space. When we go into our neighborhoods, we're talking about some different contexts, and our application should be a little bit different. This is something I see far too often in construction zones and in other areas where just old sidewalks aren't suitable for the people that want to use them. Now also imagine you're in a wheelchair or rely on another mobility device. You're forced to walk on a very narrow or move about on a very narrow 4 or 5 foot sidewalk. You're being told to stay 6 feet away from people, and you come across someone on that sidewalk. Where do you go? What do you do? And then we look at this and go, why is that person riding in the street? Well, they've made a decision for their health, safety, and general welfare that in normal times is scary enough in some locations, but at this time is even more so. So why don't we give them space? This is a construction zone application to create a barricaded pedestrian walkway and a temporary crosswalk ahead. So there's a delineated area to do this. As I said, we have the applications, we have the tools. The manual on uniform traffic control devices, you can Google it, it's free, it's some good nighttime reading, but section 6 has what's called temporary traffic controls. It's not called construction zones, it's called temporary traffic controls. When the normal function of the roadway is suspended, traffic control planning provides for continuity of the movement of motor vehicle, bicycle, and pedestrian traffic, transit operations, and access to property and utilities. Again, that's what we're asking for, a temporary suspension of the normal function of the road. And there's applications in there that you can cite. The reason it doesn't pertain just to construction zones, and we oftentimes have rallies and other things in front of the state capitol here in Boise, is the barricades and traffic control features in there are applied when we have special event closures and other things. We have a public market that closes a few blocks of streets. We're simply asking for the same thing in this situation. And I'll give you an example. Look at this glorious road. This is the definitive highway traffic sewer, where we have a minimal sidewalk on both sides. We have a table scraps bike lane, and I put the utility box in yellow as a reference point for what I'm going to show you on the next slide, because 3 years ago, for about a 12-month period, our state DOT and local highway district here in Boise did this. They converted a travel lane on that couplet to a protected bike lane. This was because the bridge that was rebuilt over the Boise River and is a state highway had a Boise River Greenbelt passage underneath it. And so to provide continuity for that, they temporarily did traffic controls, removed a lane of motor vehicle traffic, and reallocated the space. And this looks very technical and formal, but you can go to any yard at a highway agency or at a contractor, and you will see piles and piles of these jersey barriers and barricades that they routinely use. These are pretty simple applications in the grand scheme of things. And of course, this one was meant to be crash worthy on a higher speed, higher volume street. That's a very valid thing. But again, we have the tools to do it. Here's a more simpler one. If we wanted to give more space because this minimum width sidewalk doesn't provide adequate social distancing, instead of a sidewalk closure, we leave it open. We put some barricades in the travel lanes. They've even built crude but functional temporary ramp. So obviously a person in a chair, another device, a stroller, your citizen who doesn't have to deal with over can get down that space, and water filled that are put out on commonly used application. One, this is and proof that duct tape can be used for anything. A pedestrian push button has been temporarily placed over by this walkway to provide continuity through this. Again, we have the tools to do it. And here's another one of those around construction site to provide a free walkway. Look for these things in your community. Take pictures of them. Find agency's own traffic construction permit guides, because you'll find the right tools to show them for anything. Another one here for bike, like this as a permanent. Wish they would do it on Park Boulevard, Volume Street, plastic tubular out there. This is not just pertaining to right tools. Application. Bikeway selection. You may have seen this as a way to understand when more substantial bike separation or protection should be done. Is it okay? Okay. And this,
try again, but we may have to cut.
Less than 3,000. Less than. I'm sorry. That's where maybe
we're going to have to cut away. I apologize. Kelsey, I'm assuming the issue is on, and we'll bring you, but we'll share.
I believe that.
Great opportunity. As you highlighted, thinking about patient use is to improve the vehicular traffic on pedestrians, and to Jim South, it's a physical activity. Jim, I read your article. Physical activity can be helpful in the coronavirus pandemic back in the early days of the shutdown. So please tell us why a daily walk is so important at this time, between walking and the pandemic you've been engaged in.
Okay, and I
You there, Jim?
In better than what so you cannot hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Choppy as it was with. Let's give it our best shot.
Okay, I will speak close to the microphone. So what I want to talk about is relevance of physical activity during COVID-19 pandemic, and these are the want to make. The message is that powerful health and help with the coronavirus. Based on that is pandemic, and I'm going to transition to talking about how people are questioning the wisdom of walkability and especially density during the pandemic. We've been looking at this. I have have to show you on a little walkability during the pandemic. And a preview of this is an opportunity walking and active advocates, and promoting equitable solutions is more important than ever, and as we're finding out. So this is just a reminder that physical activity is one of the most powerful influences on health. Why it's inactive is the fourth leading cause of death that there is. And so, these are some of the many benefits of physical activities. And even this, one thing you don't see is benefits during infectious diseases. So that's what I'm going to focus on here. And just a very quick lesson here. Of course, we know that the coronavirus, the lungs, and lung tissue, and to replicate the virus. And so your immune system finds that invader, attacks it. And during attack, inflammation happens. That makes the lungs and inflamed, interferes with the gas. People can't breathe. Immune system this infection. When we look, found that in at least 6 ways, which is all, and severity of infection activity, like moderate physical activity for before the pandemic.
Make sure
can,
that
I'm going to well no.
put a note out to
95%
send any more that may
the
be
people
our bandwidth.
it's just not working.
Working,
So
Jim. I don't really know. If screen share and ask Jim just to talk through the presentation.
Okay, I will just continue, and you can do whatever you like with my video.
Things seem to be much more clear now. Yeah.
Well, I haven't done anything different. I'm trying to be close to the microphone. So.
It sounds good. Carry on now, Jim.
Okay, very good. So the last point was about 95% of COVID deaths are in people with chronic diseases, and those tend to be older people, and chronic conditions are much more common in African Americans, Latinos, American Indians. So there's definitely an equity issue here that physical activity can help. So the third point, moderate physical activity is one of the best stress management methods. It's as good at preventing and treating anxiety and depression as psychotherapy and medication. Okay. Oh, there we go. All right, so number 4, stress and distress create imbalances of the hormone cortisol that also negatively affects immune function and inflammation. So as moderate activity helps with stress control, it also helps with cortisol, and so that's another pathway for improving immune and inflammation. 5th, moderate activity produces antioxidants that reduce the severity of acute respiratory distress syndrome, which is a complication of COVID-19. So it helps lung function, which is obviously relevant. And in the hopefully relatively near future, this will be relevant, that both acute and chronic activity improve immune responses to vaccines. Older adults assigned to aerobic exercise were 30 to 100% more likely than those in a flexibility control group to attain sufficient antibodies from flu vaccines. So there's a likelihood that activity is going to help once we get a vaccine, especially with older adults. Now I'm going to transition to what all of this means for the built environment. And this is taken from a commentary that I've co-written with Dr. Deepti Adlakha, who is a planner and a public health expert who's now in the Northern Ireland. So we hope that this will appear in Cities and Health, special issue on COVID-19. So you can look for that. So this goes back to one of the things that was mentioned earlier. People are saying, oh, dense cities are really a problem. We need to get rid of density and triple down again on suburbs. Well, we actually looked at the density of cities in relation to COVID-19 deaths per 100,000 people. And so you see along the bottom there is population density, and we go from very, very low density. Some of those places are like Dallas and Phoenix, all the way up to the highest density that we looked at in these cities, which was Manila in the Philippines. And you can see that overall, there's really no real relationship. The red line is kind of the average, and there's a tiny increase, but very, very small. And so you can see where New York City is. New York City is the world outlier. And to us in the US, it's an extremely dense city. But in the context of the whole world, it's kind of in the middle. And you can see that Paris and this other city in France are relatively high. And so basically what we're showing here so far is that density is not driving the infections or the deaths. The infection case rate looks the same as this, pretty much. So what does that mean? I will get to that. But I also want to look more deeply, more comprehensively at walkability factors. And so I've listed common environmental attributes related to walkability, which you can see. And I put some others down toward the bottom, like parks, trails, and open space. And then open streets programs, which we've talked about. So we have evidence that all of these attributes are positively related to preventing chronic disease. The exception there being automobile optimized transportation system, so designing for cars. So that's negative related to chronic disease prevention. So we know all of these things are good for preventing chronic disease or non-communicable diseases. But what about infectious diseases? That's the ID. Well, I just showed you evidence, and this is all the evidence that I know of, that residential density is basically not related to risk of infectious disease. The public health measures can do away with or overcome whatever risk is comes from living close together. But mixed land use, this is very positive in an infectious disease pandemic, because you can walk to the store, and so you might drive less and walk more. So that's a real benefit to your physical activity. In a pandemic, well, automobiles probably are a relatively safe place, especially if you're by yourself, which of course, something like 90–95% of trips in the US are solo. So that could be a positive for infectious disease. Public transportation, well, there's a clear risk there, and something we really need to work hard to manage, and there are ways of managing it to some degree. but that's an issue that we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to not lose the benefits of public transportation for the chronic disease. Pedestrian and bicycle facilities, certainly more important than ever during the pandemic, because these are safe and active and healthy places, ways to get around, and the places that you do those on trails and in open space and that sort of thing, very important and positive for infectious diseases. And as we've been talking about open streets, also giving more space for physical activity with enough space to physically distance. So, so the way that we look at this is walkability generally benefits both chronic diseases and infectious diseases. Concerns about the risk of infectious disease contagion in urban areas are leading to these recommendations to reduce density and reliance on public transport. But urban design recommendations need to be made considering the effects on both infectious and chronic diseases, especially since chronic diseases or non-communicable diseases account for about 65% of global deaths. And the other 35% is not all infectious diseases. That includes traffic crashes and that sort of things. So if permanent urban design decisions are made solely on the basis of infectious disease risk, there could be severe, unintended, though predictable consequences for chronic disease and overall health. So conclusions, physical activity should be widely recommended and promoted during the pandemic. Walkability has mostly favorable effects on both infectious and chronic diseases. And there's no question that the pandemic is impacting older adults, people of color, and lower income communities particularly hard. So we need to focus our solutions in getting people more active and more opportunities to be active in these people at high risk. So I have two specific requests for you. One is to oppose recommendations to reduce density and transit service, because from a health point of view, this would be counterproductive. And finally, we advocates, I assume that's just about everybody on this call, should be even bolder in our advocacy for walkability, and equity. And it's going to be up to us to educate decision makers about some of these facts. So I hope most of that came through, Ian. So it's back to you.
Thank you, Jim. It did. The audio quality picked up dramatically around about the time we had the conversation. So thank you, Jim. Appreciate your presentation. And we're going to transition to our Q&A section and discussion. And because we lost some time with our technical difficulties earlier, which I apologize for, we're going to run an extra 10 minutes. So I hope people can stick around so we can hear some more from Jim, Allison, Destiny, and Dawn, and we will wrap up at 10 minutes after the hour. So to get us started, I want to stick to that important topic, the discussion that's going on around whether density is inherently unhealthy, whether we should all spread out and live in lower density communities. And go to you, Destiny. As you think about this issue, as you look at the data, the per capita cases and deaths in New York City in particular, how else can we explain, what are the other factors at play in that particular case, other than population density, that may be relevant for the terrible toll that the disease has taken in New York City?
I think the obvious answer to that question is I think what comes with population density or city centers that are full of predominantly Black and brown people is an overwhelming amount of structural racism. And I think when we look at a city like New York, which is vast, but also has a vast legacy of structural racism, And their actual interventions for COVID-19 rely heavily on the structures and systems that are most likely to perpetuate structural racism, like the police department. We see exacerbated outcomes with COVID-19. I would also say that, a lot of times these cities, these older cities, were spatially designed in a way that inhibits people's access to quality of life destinations like um, emergency rooms and mental health interventions and various other things that would improve health outcomes during or regardless of COVID-19. Access to those spaces, places, and services are very limited. And so I think density is just, it probably is exacerbating what was already there, but I would caution us to not rely too heavily on density as a contributing factor unless we're willing to invest in actually resolving the systems and structures that uphold what it is about density that's creating the challenge for us, if that makes sense.
It did make sense, Destiny. Thank you for that. Nevertheless, people will have to maintain physical distancing going forward. So what does that mean? And I'm looking to Alison. What does that mean for enhancing walkable communities? What does it mean for public transportation, which is such an important component of walkable communities, as we look to the future, the near future, living with COVID?
Well, right now it doesn't look great. Public transit ridership is down 95% in San Francisco, and you'll see those drop similarly throughout the country. There's a great fear that what's going to happen through all of this is that people are just going to see a car as their safest and, in fact, only option, which will create congestion even worse than what we saw pre-COVID. So much right now comes down to funding, and a reallocation is completely necessary, and that funding should go to transit improvements, walkability improvements, pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure improvements, and not to road maintenance and the building of new roads. The current federal administration, of course, shows very little interest in doing this. It's up to the states to do everything they can, and for us as citizens to advocate for funding to go in the right place. We really need to focus on a future that gives us many, many ways to get around the places we live. Longer term, this is a time for serious reconsideration of land use, certainly for all the equity and issues related to prior redlining and discrimination that Destiny mentions, but also that we've completely validated and legitimized designing for supercommutes, for people to drive 1, 2, 3 hours to work every day. Now that people may not be going into offices with the regularity that they are, that work patterns may shift, how can we think about people living with greater access to jobs? How can we redesign our cities and towns so that they're more community focused, that people, can we adopt systems like 20-minute living where everything that you need is within a 20-minute walk, bike, or transit ride within where you live? These are the larger things that we need to start seriously contending with.
Great. I love that 20-minute walk shared and doing some really creative planning so that, as you say, people can live their lives without needing to travel great distances every day. Don, I want to just transition to you and get your input on these ideas, and in particular, how do advocates communicate with elected officials and transportation departments who are facing serious budget shortfalls with tax revenues so far down right now? And also, Don, if you wanted to kind of wrap up the conclusions from your presentation, since we kind of lost audio quality when you were on.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. That was the last slide. So just that upper right portion is where I think we need to think about more substantial barricades and not just put cones to give a bike or pedestrian space on a high-speed, high-volume roadway. From a budget standpoint, I think there's some validity about that, but again, there's some regard to call it on the carpet a little bit. We're still going to widen roads for motorists who won't exist until 2040. So getting some temporary barricades and things that we already have on hand to create this space in the meantime isn't a tough lift or a tough ask in the grand scheme of things. I think it's more about priorities and values than it is funding. I want to couple on something that Destiny brought up that I think is important, and there's an Andy Singer cartoon about, we'll give these bicyclists this great parallel bikeway. And we have this bike boulevard concept in Boise. Let's not forget that when we are trying to allocate these spaces, they have to connect to things, to grocery stores, to job centers, to parks. It's not just out to joyride or joy walk on a street. While some do that, we want people to be able to reach places. And oftentimes we miss that last 2 or 3 block or quarter-mile section that we have to overcome to cross a major intersection or go along a major road, because that's where those destinations are often located. So keep that in mind when we think of a network perspective in making these asks.
Great, thank you, Don. Alison, back to you. We had a question from a member of the audience around what is happening or what could be happening in smaller communities and rural communities. So anything that you've heard or any recommendations you have for opening streets and creating better access to physical activity in those smaller communities?
Yeah, I might suggest looking at the work of Build a Better Block, which is a group that started in Texas, but holds workshops and has kind of spawned imitators across the United States that really do kind of one block at a time transformations. My favorite anecdote is when Jason Roberts, who started it, went to transform one block in his neighborhood and realized that many of the things he wanted to do were in violation of local code, but he went ahead and did them anyway and made little signs saying, hey, this bench is in violation of code, etc. Brought the city councilman through, took them on a walk through. They realized how absurd these code restrictions were, and they actually turned over many of them. I think that in communities that don't have the density that we're talking about, they can really think about creating small gathering places. I think what's really important, especially because this is, it feels like we're in wartime now, right? There's just like people are dying every day, and we need to learn how to rely on one another again. And particularly smaller communities can use walkable streets to get to that. I'm bringing dinner to my 92-year-old neighbor several times a week. He's right next door. We all need to start looking after our neighbors, taking, of course, the health precautions that we need to. But how can we shrink distances to find ways to help one another? And I think walkability and creating spaces of gathering with appropriate social distancing is very important.
Yeah, and I can endorse your recommendation for Build a Better Block. I participated in one of their projects in a small town in Iowa a couple of years ago, and it's transformative if you have the municipal support from the city leadership. We are almost out of time, so I want to just go around one last question and ask each of you, and I'm going to start with you, Jim. What is one short-term action that people can do in the next few days or the next few weeks to guide the policy and environment future in a positive way for healthy communities, for walkability, and for equity?
I would like to see many more people be like America Walks members and say that I'm going to be a voice for making my community and my neighborhood better. I think staying at home has probably made people value more what's local to them, since not everybody is driving far every day. So being motivated to advocate for wider sidewalks, for safe places to bike, for more mixed use. I need to be able to walk or bike to stores from now on. I'd like to see more of that.
Great, thanks, Jim. We do say that we like to build the local capacity of the national walking movement. Destiny, your one short-term, medium-term recommendation for people.
It looks like she's had to go.
Oh, okay. Well, Destiny, we appreciate having you here. Don, your recommendation.
Since so many city councils are having meetings via Zoom and easier to join, most of these organizations have a public communication period at the end. Go out to construction zones. We're starting that season in a lot of places, and take pictures of these and make it relatable in that way. We have the tools to do it. Let's try it and let them, then be the creative ones, but put it in front of them that we're not talking something out of left field or rocket science by any means here.
Thanks, Don. And Alison, you get the last word.
Sure. I think that so many people are good at complaining to their local government about things. If there are interventions that are happening now that you like, if you like having some streets closed down, if you like having golf courses opened up to pedestrians, by all means, please write a positive note and say that you do. Also, please consider organizations like America Walks and Spur and so many others that are advocating for these kinds of things. Everyone's dollars are short right now, but if you can support them financially, but if you can also just make an effort to let local officials know that you like what they're doing, or alternately make sure you write to them and ask them to do these things that we're talking about here if they're not doing it already.
That's great advice, Alison. Every one of these decisions that affects an entire community is the result of pushes and pulls in different directions, and congratulating officials when they do something that you like is very important. Well, we are out of time. I do want to again thank our sponsors, the CDC, APBP, MIG, BetterHelp, and the Everybody Walk Collaborative. Thanks to our presenters, Don Kostelek, Destiny Thomas, Alison Arieff, and Jim Salas, technical manager Kelsey Card, and you, our online audience. Please complete a brief online evaluation that you'll receive, that you'll land on when the webinar ends. We are going to be back again on Thursday, May 28th to continue this discussion with a look at the research on how municipalities are responding to increased demand for safe public space. And then we have 2 more webinars in early June, a conversation with neuroscientist Shane O'Mara, who's just published In Praise of Walking, a new scientific exploration, and a look at the use of public art to enhance walkable spaces. My apologies again for the technical difficulties we had in the middle of the broadcast. I look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Cheers for now.